Good morning. Good to see you all. Sambhi from Tokyo. I am John Bradford, the Executive Director of YCAPS, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's conversation. Today we'll be talking about Indonesia's potential to become a maritime leader. As most of you are aware, Indonesia is the world's fourth largest nation. It is also an archipelago which with nearly 20,000 islands sits across the important sea lanes of the world. It has a rich maritime heritage. Mariners from today's Indonesia cross the Indian Ocean in sufficient numbers that the modern population of Madagascar is believed to trace its roots to 30 Indonesian mothers. Sriwijaya and the Riau Sultanate were powerful maritime states. During the UNCLOS negotiations, the Indonesian delegation was quite powerful and is often credited with the creation of the rules applicable to archipelagic states today. Today, the International Chamber of Shipping tells us that Indonesia follows China and the Philippines to be the third largest supplier of seafarers. When President Jokowi entered office in 2014, he brought with him a signature doctrine, the global maritime fulcrum. More recently, Indonesia has captured headlines by, quote, standing up to or setting limits on PRC maritime ambitions in the southern portions of the South China Sea. Indonesia has renamed its waters, made a show of burning boats detained for illegal fishing, and videos of its forces out in action on the water have surfaced in social media. In May this year, Indonesia submitted a note verbal to the US Secretary General stating that China's wide-ranging claims of historical rights in the South China Sea clearly lack international basis, and that Indonesia is not bound by those claims. Yet Indonesian maritime contests are not just with China, but also with neighbors such as Malaysia, Vietnam, and others. It's worth noting that Indonesia's activities in the area of maritime cooperation are also exemplary. It participates in joint patrols with its neighbors in the Strait of Malacca and the Sulu Sea and plays a central role in the Coral Triangle Initiative. American naval theorist Alfred Mahan identified 6 fundamental elements of sea power: geographic position, physical conformation, extent of territory, size of population, character of the people, and character of the government. It would seem that Indonesia possesses all 6 of these important elements. However, Indonesia has not clearly been seen as an international leader in this maritime domain. In fact, generally speaking, when we see Indonesia stand up and show strength, there's a rush of international analysis celebrating this movement, and that analysis is quickly dismissed as either over-optimistic wishful thinking or even a fundamental misunderstanding of Indonesia's core characteristics. Today, we've invited 2 leading experts to help us unpack these contradictions and understand Indonesia's potential as a maritime leader. Evan Laksmana is a senior researcher at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Jakarta. Natalie Sambhi is founder and executive director of Verve Research, an independent research collective focused on relationships between militaries and societies. I have to say I know these 2 individuals quite well, and those titles do little to convey the breadth of their experience or their expertise. I would strongly encourage you to visit the Pacific Forum webpage or ycaps.org so you can look at the event details and understand just who these great people are. So before they start, let me offer a few remarks about this event. The event is co-hosted by YCAPS and the Pacific Forum. YCAPS is a professional development organization active in Japan's communities that host US military and self-defense forces. We help people learn more about the region and where they operate. It puts context to the military's operations into view, and it also helps people in the communities understand the strategic imperatives of those forces. The Pacific Forum is a foreign policy think tank in Honolulu. Unlike most YCAPS events, this discussion will be on the record and is being recorded. After editing, the recorded will be made available to the public. If you have a question for the panelists, please either type it into the chat window or use the raise hand function so as the moderator, can call on you. So with that, we'll kick things off, and I invite both of our guests to answer the foremost question. Does Indonesia have the potential to be a maritime leader? And I'll ask Evan to answer that first.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you, YCAPS and the Pacific Forum for hosting me today. The first question from John, does Indonesia have a potential as a maritime power? The answer is obviously yes, but the question is whether or not we will be in a perpetual potential state or will we actually actualize that potential. And to dig a bit deeper, to that argument, I'd like to raise three big points for our first set of remarks. First, I'll speak a little bit about what I think to be the equation for maritime power for states like Indonesia. And then I'll speak a little bit more about the global maritime fulcrum doctrine that John mentioned, which was the signature doctrine of Jokowi's first term. And then lastly, I'll speak about what I think are some of the variables for understanding what kind of prospects would we have in the coming years. First, as far as maritime power is concerned, I think for Indonesia, we have to separate the distinction between sea power and maritime power. If we see sea power in terms of projecting naval capabilities across our waters, that's not what we're aiming for. I think at our stage, we consider maritime power as the ability to manage the seas and the resources within it, and how that can boost the overall state power, which means this is our ability to safeguard our resources and manage the waters. One variation of what John mentioned earlier about Mahan's conception of a maritime power is actually an equation developed by Ray Klein and Vijay a couple of years ago about how perceived maritime power is some combination of geography, of economy, of military capabilities, as well as strategic purpose and political will. To that equation, I would like to add a unity of purpose. I think the ability to manage domestic maritime governance among different competing agencies, I think is central to realizing both the geographical, the economic, and the military capability elements of a maritime power. And then the strategic purpose, I think, is where Jokowi's a global maritime doctrine comes in, and the political will to implement that. So based on that rough equation of what is perceived maritime power, I think if you look at the unity of purpose, the strategic purpose, which is the doctrine, and the political will, I think this is one starting point to assess to what extent the global maritime fulcrum has helped Indonesia seek out and develop its full maritime potential. The problem, I think, with the global maritime fulcrum is that we have so many different ways of interpreting it that we couldn't fully agree on how to measure its effects. I think one element looks at from its specific policy elements, which is the global maritime fulcrum had sort of domestic inward-looking elements. This is about building the maritime economy, about developing inter-island connectivity and all that. And then there's the external elements that focus on naval diplomacy and maritime diplomacy, as well as foreign policy that's oriented towards the maritime sphere. The second way of looking at it is whether or not the doctrine itself is actually three different things between a philosophy, a worldview, if you will, about how to place Indonesia within its broader history as a maritime state. Or we can see it as a foreign policy doctrine, which is the way to envision how to strengthen Indonesia at the centerpiece of the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, or whether we're talking about very specific policies that are designed by the government to reach those doctrines. And I think, unfortunately, as a guiding doctrine, a one grand strategic outlook, if you will, that sort of integrates and guides the day-to-day policy, I think the global maritime fulcrum is dead under the first term administration. Despite the fact that I think maritime challenges remain, issues of maritime concern are persisting. But I think as far as the GMF as a doctrine is concerned, I think it's dead. So when we look at going back to the initial idea about those equation between the unity of purpose, the strategic purpose, and political will, the sea policy document that the Jokowi administration issued that was supposed to be the translating document for the global maritime fulcrum actually did not solve the problem of the unity of purpose. I think the sea policy document became a bureaucratic umbrella that draws in from different agencies and ministries of their pre-existing programs that are somehow related to the maritime domain, and then they cluster them together into this one big umbrella document. So it doesn't create a way to unify the policies. It doesn't create new resources to push those agencies to create a more coherent policy. So from that angle, I think as far as unity of purpose, both the GMF and the Sea Policy document never solve that problem. When it comes to the doctrine as a political will, as we can see in the past few months, aside from COVID, Jokowi also never really mentioned GMF anymore since he won his second term during his inauguration and all that. The focus has always been on the economy, on human resources and capital development, on the Industrial Revolution, on investment and all that. So I think the GMF as a guiding doctrine, as far as both political will and strategic purpose, I think are dead. So what does this leave us for Indonesia's prospect as a maritime power? I think there are three starting points in which we can think of the different potential variables that may affect the prospects ahead. First, if you look at it from a top-down approach, which is from the presidential side of things, I think the problem is that Jokowi's personalities, personal preferences, and inclinations have never been geared towards managing the day-to-day affairs of geopolitics, of maritime security and all that. So to expect Jokowi to suddenly change his preferences and start managing these issues, I think that's a bit unrealistic. So as long as the president is not personally involved and invested in pushing through some of these maritime security issues, I think it will all be left to the different bureaucratic agencies. So which means the key factor in understanding Indonesia's maritime behavior is to what extent do you understand the different bureaucratic preferences between the fisheries ministry, between the foreign ministry, between the defense ministry, between the Coast Guard. And I think the interaction and the politics between these different agencies are what's driving and will be continuing driving the maritime behavior for the years ahead. The second way of looking at it is to what extent is there a bottom-up approach from both these different bureaucratic agencies I mentioned earlier, as well as from the broader civil society groups, expert communities, as well as from Parliament. If there is a way to push through stronger collaboration on, let's say, joint training and exercises, or even joint education between, let's say, the different maritime law enforcement agencies and the Navy, for example, I think it's fine not to have a centralized solution to the overlapping authorities of Indonesia's maritime agencies. But these smaller scale bottom-up approaches and cooperations are very embryonic. It's being discussed, but it's not being discussed seriously. There are discussions of possibly drafting an omnibus maritime security law that will once and for all solve all of these maritime security problems. I doubt that's forthcoming now under COVID, and I doubt we can solve it all in one go. And lastly, I think I mentioned COVID a couple of times today, but I think this means that with COVID where the government is trying to address COVID in its own way, I think resources, both human as well as financial resources, will be drawn and mostly focused on addressing COVID. So ways to improve assets, build new capabilities for the Coast Guards and the Navy might have to take a bit of a backseat. There are discussions, I think, to figure out ways that maybe we can boost operational readiness in the meantime before we can get back to normal economic mode. But I doubt that's forthcoming right now. So I think not only is Indonesia's potential as a maritime power is already hampered by structural features of domestic politics and bureaucratic politics, but I think COVID is a major strategic distraction for strategic planning, resource development, and future plans. And I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to discussing the issues more. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Evan. Natalie, your take on the same question.
Great. Thanks very much for that, John. Firstly, I want to thank Yokosuka Council and Asia Pacific Studies Pacific Forum. Thank you, John, Shira, Jeff, and thanks to Evan, my co-panelist as well. So to answer the question, I mean, I probably took this more as Indonesia being a maritime leader more than a power. So probably my angle on things is a little bit different. I'd like to make 3 quick points just to give you a break to my presentation today. First, I'm going to say that, yeah, Indonesia, to reiterate what Evan said, does have the potential to be a maritime leader. But what does maritime leadership look like? It would be hampered. The second point I'd like to make is that it is hampered in one particular area, and that's security. And that the third point is that when looking to Indonesia as a maritime leader, partners like Australia need, putting it bluntly, a bit of a reality check as well to look at the actual strengths and not just the potential. All right, so to take the first point and to answer John's question in a nutshell, does Indonesia have the potential to be a maritime leader? I'd say yes, and I think actually it has. Because if you think about leadership, and if leadership, a crucial element of that is about vision, then I think an important legacy, if not from Jokowi's first term, is this idea that Indonesia has returned to thinking about itself as a maritime nation, even if that has not been fully realized, and that other countries in the region are starting to identify Indonesia more in those terms of ambitions as well. So I agree with Evan that certainly the global maritime fulcrum has not met its goals. It has not survived in the second term of Jokowi, but I think that there were some important developments in the first term that give us a little bit of encouragement, but they also set a precedent for Indonesia's forays into more of these maritime domains. I'll just point to a couple of them. I think certainly the proliferation of talking about the Indo-Pacific, that discursive shift in Jokowi's first term, building on Martin Natalegawa's first conceptualizations of that, I think has been a really important development. The idea of the Indo-Pacific has become germane to not just Indonesia's foreign policy thinking, but its strategic policy thinking as well. The increase of trilateral engagement between India, Indonesia, and Australia, particularly at senior officers meeting level, that's those sorts of trilateral engagements becoming more and more common, but certainly centered more around the maritime domain as well. Even looking towards Indonesia's eastern flank in terms of the South Pacific, that kind of diplomacy could also have a maritime element, especially where the preservation of maritime resources is concerned, including fish stocks. But even the shared maritime vision of the Indo-Pacific with India, I think, is another feather in Indonesia's cap, where again, these legacies of Jokowi's first term have played an important role in that mutual shaping of identity. So I'm probably going to be a little bit more on the esoteric side than the sort of hard policy side than Evan, but I think these things are still important. And of course, continuing on with Indonesia's past endeavors in this maritime domain, continued participation in ASEAN, the continuing raising of maritime issues, talking about the blue economy, its participation in IORA, even things like the Bali process, where a lot of those transnational crimes are maritime related, I think are important signs of Indonesia's continued commitment, if not under the auspices of the GMF, but certainly in practical senses in the way in which other countries respond to Indonesia, I think is an important legacy again of those initial idea, that initial vision that President Jokowi has. So overall, yes, the potential is there, but I think, like Evan said, that there are challenges, and I think the potential for maritime leadership could actually be better focused in a couple of niche areas. I would say quickly, and perhaps we can unpack this in the Q&A, but areas such as maritime law, the recent affirmation, the diplomatic note to the UN, the affirmation of UNCLOS, the ideas of archipelagic waters, maritime environmental protection, and maritime economic development. Now, I think those niche areas have greater potential than overall leadership in the Indo-Pacific for Indonesia, is because they're vital issues to Indonesia, which has a dependency on the ocean as a source of livelihood and of nutrition. I also think Indonesia is well placed to be a player on these issues because it's good at balancing interests between multiple players. It is inherently non-aligned and will remain non-aligned for the foreseeable future. And also, in particular, I think Evan likes to talk a lot about structure and agency, and there are certain cases where key personalities have been able to push forward some of these niche areas. The former Maritime Affairs Minister Suja Pujiastuti, the rock star of the Jokowi's first cabinet, was one such individual who was passionate about maritime protection, maritime environmental protection. Some of that maritime environmental protection has come a little bit off the agenda with her successor, Eddie Prabowo. But in particular, there's been a recent survey done of the performance of key ministers, and the top ministers have been Sri Mulyani, Eric Thorir, Prabowo Subianto, and Retno Marsudi. So someone like Retno Marsudi, I would say, is the quiet achiever of the Jokowi cabinet, and she's made gains linking up with other maritime states and pushing forward certain kinds of maritime diplomacy. So again, I think key personalities in certain niche areas of maritime leadership could work quite well. So that's what could work. Where might not Indonesian leadership in the maritime domain not work? And I think one of the most challenging areas is probably within security. And now in terms of norm entrepreneurship, that is something that could be subsumed under the diplomatic side. But in terms of leadership, it's not just charisma and a vision that you need. At certain times, it's not just character, but capability. And I think, as Evan pointed out, there will be challenges in continuing to build up Indonesia's maritime capability alongside its land ones. So I think one of the things that we have to think about, as Evan alluded to, is that there are challenges of COVID. And twice already this year, the defense budget has been cut. And the various statements made by the Ministry of Defense have said that this is not going to fill personnel cuts, but this may either delay or cause a reprioritization of a lot of the defense capability projects. So it remains to be seen how that actually plays out in terms of purchases. But I think there will be an impact certainly on the further development, the modernization of Indonesia's Air Force and Navy as well. And I think as a part of that is what we can see in COVID is this reinforcement of a lot of the land presence throughout Indonesia, that the Indonesian military has been traditionally army dominant. And those influences, I think, continue today, despite Indonesia's efforts to try and reorient itself, particularly on the defense side of being more a maritime nation. The inertia of a lot of its internal security problems, the legacies and influence of people who have been in the army uniform, I think continues to have a strong influence on Indonesia's foreign policy culture and strategic culture as well. And we perhaps can go back into that during Q&A. And I think inevitably it's because Indonesia, with its specific set of challenges, its geography, its demographics, its socioeconomic sort of distribution throughout the country, it does need its military. Maybe not in ways that other analysts in other countries, other observers in other countries may necessarily understand. We see a lot of commentary lately about militarization, about potential military comeback. Evan's written a really useful report drilling down as to whether or not the COVID response was militarized. But I think it's always really careful to understand why army dominance exists in a place like Indonesia. What impact does that have on the maritime capabilities? And why might that be set to continue as well? And just quickly, if you just want to take one recent example, Indonesia is set to experience more intensified droughts this year. And so President Jokowi has then tasked the Ministry of Defense in particular, to be exercised with dealing with food security. Now, that is not necessarily a traditional domain. It will be working together with the Ministry of Agriculture, but I use it as an example to sort of see where things might be done differently, particularly in an archipelago that has challenges of reaching people in remote areas, and you have an institution with a well-developed sense of logistics and readiness as well. Again, it may not be optimal from our perspective of civil military relations, but again, understanding the context that Indonesia is in and understanding what those constraints on the maritime leadership might look like gives us a better understanding. So then that brings me to point number 3. When looking from the perspective of a regional partner like Australia, taking all of this to account, what does that mean? Do we want Indonesia to be a maritime leader? And if we do, what's realistic? I think in the coming decades, there are questions being raised about sustained US leadership in the region, if at all, if that's something that all countries had consensus about, but certainly American presence has been an important form of stabilization and security in the maritime domain. So while the United States has a lot of it on its plate, I think regional partners like Australia, if you look at some of the recent speeches by the foreign and defense ministers, we're starting to ask questions about where are the sites of influence and leadership within the Indo-Pacific. And so increasingly, if areas like multilateralism are the way to go, if we might have what is either a bipolar or multipolar system, what kind of role can Indonesia play? And if Indonesia is good at multilateralism, then maybe that is the kind of leadership that it could take. And maybe we can unpack that in the Q&A. But I think certainly when talking about Indonesian leadership from an Australian point of view, I think it's important to take into account the limitations that I talked about before, the potential and the limitations. So for that, I have three points to offer. The first is to be realistic, to temper expectations about what Indonesia can do, and also to see Indonesia in and of itself, not just a block of Southeast Asian states. So Indonesia has its specific interests, and I think the temptation in a lot of foreign policy circles is to lump Southeast Asia and ASEAN together. This might sound a little bit obvious, but to engage as much as possible in the foreign policy and strategic history of Indonesia in the 20th century, path dependency is not everything, but it is something that will help give us a bit of a deeper understanding when we're thinking about what we can expect from a part like Indonesia. And the third, from all that I've mentioned today, is to remain optimistic, continue to look for opportunities to work on multilateral initiatives, particularly where maritime law, environmental protection, and maritime economy is concerned, and to look side by side, to work side by side. I think when my experiences of having worked in a place like Canberra have often told me that the discourse and the rhetoric can often talk about what a country like Australia can do for Indonesia, or what a country like the United States can do for Indonesia. I think we're at a point now where we should start thinking about what is Indonesia going to do for us and how can we support that. And it's subtle, but I think it's a really important mentality, and that will actually help us build a much stronger and more practical relationship when we're looking at things like trilateral cooperation and so forth. So I think I'll end it there.
Okay, thanks. I'm fairly confident that the Q&A session is going to drive us very quickly into security and questions of Indonesia-China relationships. So I'd like to ask you a totally separate question and see if we can create as much diversity in the conversation as possible in this hour. Both of you mentioned Indonesia's role as a diplomatic leader in the maritime area outside of security. I'm thinking specifically, both of you mentioned environmental protection. Both of you mentioned maritime law, which we often think equals UNCLOS, equals Southeast Asia, equals South China Sea, but really maritime law is far broader than that. And then the third one that I didn't hear you mention, but I'm really personally interested in, is the protection of mariners. We have 100,000 plus merchant seafarers right now, either stranded or in extended contracts during COVID. Personally, I haven't looked that deeply, but I have looked into this, and I see a very active Philippines position on it. And they are the second largest supplier of mariners, but Indonesia is third, and I haven't heard anything from Indonesia. Is that indicative of my bad research skills, or is that actually a quiet space in Jakarta's dialogue? So generally speaking, I'd just be interested to hear you both comment more about what Indonesia is doing diplomatically on the maritime front outside of security. Evan, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Let me start from that last question about mariners. And I think the problem with us trying to push that issue forward is that we actually have a pretty difficult challenge managing labor and workforce in general, and trying to get different agencies involved with regards to mariners, from the foreign ministry to the manpower ministry and all that, I think has been exceptionally difficult. So I think it's the absence of a multi-stakeholder hub, if you will, to push and fix those ideas. But I think in the past few months, there's been increasing attention on it because of the cruel treatment that Indonesian mariners have received on Chinese fishing vessels in particular. And I think these are one of the few instances that where Indonesian foreign ministry officials and spokesperson have been very explicitly harsh about how the issue has been depicted in the media. I think the way that these mariners have been treated, how they died and everything, it's just been a big mess. But the only response we've got from the Chinese side has been, we'll investigate it by law, but we don't really know what happens with the investigation. So I think this particular mariner issue and how they're treated, I think could be a potential acrimonious flashpoint, if you will, between Indonesia and China beyond just about the Natuna. And going back to your point about the diplomatic leadership. I think again, I'm quite cognizant of the fact that foreign ministry tends to be a different type of leader when it comes to pushing these ideas forward in Indonesia. But oftentimes, domestically within Indonesia, outside of the foreign ministry, the different agencies, fisheries, navy, and all that, and Coast Guard sometimes have different understanding of UNCLOS and how to interpret certain clauses. For example, to what extent can we provide strong law enforcement in disputed waters that's officially being negotiated, let's say between us and Vietnam. We have a tendency to, some of the agencies outside of the foreign ministry have a tendency to interpret a much stronger and assertive position when it comes to those issues. So I think before Indonesia can actually, quote unquote, socialize the region and beyond about UNCLOS, I think Indonesia needs to invest in terms of figuring out how to disseminate a common understanding of UNCLOS among the different agencies. And we have a problem because I think there is a bit of a stagnation in the next generation of maritime law experts in Indonesia. It's been pretty slow. There's a few younger generation scholars, but it's very hard to find more Hashim Jalals, for example, in Indonesia. So I think that impedes our ability to play a more niche role in terms of trying to socialize and have a common understanding of UNCLOS in the region. And I think this goes back to Natalie's point about the kind of maritime diplomacy that we can expect, whether it's about the Indo-Pacific outlook or about something else. But I think the problem with ASEAN is that it seems to me that when it comes to specific issues like maritime, there's more room for cooperation for a minilateral setting rather than an ASEAN-wide setting. I think discussions between Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia, between Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, I think have tended to be more fruitful when it comes to maritime issues rather than an ASEAN-wide mechanism. So for me, if there is the need to develop much more high quality and in-depth leadership at the maritime domain for Indonesia, I would rather we put our resources for a minilateral setting than an ASEAN setting. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, I wouldn't mind just picking up Evan's point about Hashim Jalal. I think that goes back to the point I think we've both made about the importance of personalities. The ability, John, to answer your question, the ability for Indonesia to work in areas outside of maritime security, in areas like maritime law, yeah, they are constrained by the number of people, but I think it's the type of people. One of the reasons I said that maritime economy was an area that I thought had potential is because of its sponsorship by one of the president's key advisors, Luhut Panjaitan. And so I think having someone like that pushing it forward would take it so far, but the potential for Indonesian leadership beyond that, I think, is going to be constrained. But I definitely agree with Evan. I think that Indonesia has had a lot of successes where minilateralism is concerned. And there are lots of different other permutations of that. Australia, Philippines, Indonesia as well, and maritime issues, in some sort of strategic triangle that's there. I think even looking at Indonesia's past successes as part of the Bali process, as I mentioned earlier, yes, in terms of human security, that is an area, but it's been longstanding leadership by Indonesia. It's a forum that's co-chaired by Australia and Indonesia. So I would point to that as another success. More, again, maybe touching on the human security side, but the potential sort of look at other sorts of humanitarian issues under those auspices. But I think another area I'd like to point to is civil maritime safety. There's been a long-standing relationship between Australia and Indonesia, for instance, with Australia's Maritime Safety Authority, as another example, again, of where Indonesia is working towards a kind of partnership, kind of common understanding, but it's not strictly within the maritime security purview as well.
Great. So both of you mentioned in your answers now and in your initial comments the power of individuals and the need for individual leaders in or from Indonesia in order to guide Indonesian national leadership. So I find it very interesting that the Global Maritime Fulcrum was Jokowi's signature program, but then Evan, you said he's not actually interested in it. And then it fell off because he wasn't interested in it. So is it someone else's program? And if it is it just one person's? Is it just Lahud's and that's all? And is there a potential for it to come back? Or where exactly does that sit? Either of you.
Sure. Well, let's look at the history of how the GMF came about. It wasn't based on long years of research and policy engagement. It was a campaign platform. It was, I believe, created over breakfast before the first presidential debate between Jokowi and Prabowo, I think. So this wasn't a well-developed a doctrinal document. So that's key, which means that whatever impact a particular doctrine might have once Jokowi is in power will depend on who's there to sort of make sure that they're being implemented and all that. The key architect of that document, my former boss, Rizal Sukma, has left Jakarta to became ambassador to London in 2017, I believe. So he's not there. Andi Wijayanto, who used to be a part of the architect of that document, also left his position. So I think it all depends on Luhut and a few others. But the problem, I think there was genuine energy and excitement and focus. Maybe the first 1 or 2 years of Jokowi's first term with this GMF. Jokowi was quite interested in the beginning, for example, how to boost Bakamla as Indonesia's potential sole coast guard and how to fix maritime governance. But I think he just had other priorities along the way, and maritime was just not something that he paid attention on a daily basis anymore. So yeah, it was just left to the bureaucracy to handle. I think the last one to make a push at it was probably Ambassador Havas, who's now ambassador to Germany. But when he was the deputy coordinating minister for maritime affairs, he was the last one who pushed for some of the GMF stuff to become the Ocean Sea Policy, how to draft a white paper on maritime diplomacy. And in fact, he was the one at a press conference who cited the tribunal ruling as one of the bases of Indonesia's new map in 2017. So when Havas also left, we don't have that many champions left in Jakarta to push different ways that the GMF could be interpreted into more concrete policies. And I think Jokowi simply wasn't, and he never was somebody who was interested in governing Indonesia as a big power with all of its geopolitical intricacies and all that. He's interested in governing Indonesia in terms of the economy, in terms of infrastructure and all that, and social welfare. So I think that's what he thinks about on a day-to-day basis. So if you ask me if the doctrine is making a comeback under its current format, it won't. I think Jokowi has enough problems until the end of his second term. So I think if it were to make a comeback in some different format, it would have to wait until for a new administration.
Okay. Natalie, you have anything to?
Yeah, look, it's a shame, I think. There was so much potential with the GMF, but as Evan outlined, it was just far too ambitious. The 5 pillars that we look at, if you're talking about building a maritime culture, that's generational shift. And while Indonesia might have had this Nusantara outlook, and has, by nature of its geography, and there are other elements that you showed that should have been conducive to that kind of thing, I think what was trying to be achieved, what was set up as Jokowi's ambitions in 5 years was too much. And so there's no surprise in some ways that it's probably easier to brush it under the carpet and not use the words GMF. And so because, as Evan pointed out, that was a policy-related platform, I can't see any successive president adopting that kind of language. All we can hope for is what I said as my opening statement, that there are legacies of maritimeness that I think have infused some of the priorities and policies of Indonesia subsequent to 2014. And I think in that sense, once Indonesia has done things like signed a shared maritime vision with places like India, there is going to be an encouragement about to continue those kinds of foreign policy investments and see where the potential might be. So I'm a bit more optimistic in that side. But with even, again, I see that there are, without those key personalities adopting and driving certain elements of that on, there was no way that each one of those 5 pillars was going to be pushed forward, perhaps in the way in which, the expectation that was raised, to meet that expectation that was raised. So we shall see going forward. But yeah, I don't think the GMF, its language, its branding, I think will survive. If you look even just at maritime security, Jokowi's first term defense minister, General Riyamisa, a lot of people, again, with that sort of army influence. Prabowo Subianto has had a very different approach now at purchasing military capability that's not necessarily guided strongly by a maritime sense. So we'll see what happens. But you can see where, if you look at the patterns within the first term, the personalities behind that, where that was almost being set up to fail as well. So, personally, I would like to see a continuation of that maritimeness, because I think it's so vital to Indonesia. It's set itself up already in that way at that maritime actor. So it is a shame to have seen some of that energy drain away. So hopefully we can be a bit more optimistic going forward.
Okay. Personally, I really want to talk more about those cultural legacies, but I think it's time that we turn to the audience. Malcolm Cook has a good question. He asks, if Indonesia is a potential leading maritime power, what states would be the potential followers, and what would be the potential institutions for Indonesian leadership? I guess if we're going back and forth, maybe we'll just continue on with Evan.
Sure. I think this is why at the beginning I was very clear about what do I think about the concept of maritime power, because I don't really see Indonesia as pursuing this idea of some sort of regional leader in terms of crafting and shaping the maritime domain to our liking and even sort of ensuring that everybody has the same understanding of UNCLOS. I think for now, a realistic understanding of Indonesia as a maritime power is simply the ability of Indonesia to safeguard and manage its waters and the resources therein. So I'm not envisioning Indonesia as a maritime power in terms of leading the way for other countries. I'm more interested in Indonesia leading, providing or becoming a maritime power for its own capabilities and not as a leader in the region. What would be the potential institutions for such leadership? For me, I think the biggest problem, bureaucratically speaking, isn't about a rhetorics or multilateralism. I think for me, the institutions is domestic. To what extent Indonesia can finally address the overlapping authorities of the different maritime agencies and maritime law enforcement arm of the state, whether it's from the Fisheries Ministry, the Marine Police, the Navy, the Coast Guard. I think addressing this morass of different institutions, I think has to be the first prerequisite and necessary requirement for any kind of maritime power or leadership. And then, of course, once we get around to fixing the maritime governance sphere, I think managing the broader strategic sphere, which is the connection between foreign policy, defense, and the maritime sphere, I think would be the next step. So I think for me, if you ask me about institutions, I don't think there's any regional institutions to speak of that would matter unless we fix the domestic side of the institutions.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Evan. There's, you have to kind of sort your house out before you go outside. But I think there's still something to be said about leading by example. And I think there might be potential. I don't want to use the word follower because that sounds far too subordinate. But I think partnership, if Indonesia takes the lead in certain kinds of partnerships in niche areas, again, in terms of protecting environment, the maritime environment, protecting fish stocks, I think a good place to start might actually be its eastern flank. And that might be problematic over tensions within South Pacific states with Indonesia's ongoing tensions within the Papuan provinces. But certainly, I think if you look at the burgeoning relationship between Indonesia and Timor-Leste, it's one of those examples, again, I think, of a good partnership where Indonesia, just due to its experience, size, development of its bureaucracy, by nature of that experience, can lead, I suppose, to some extent, Timor-Leste and help bolster and strengthen. I think it's very hard to say Indonesia. How would regional states see Indonesian leadership? Would India, for instance, be happy with that? Would Japan be happy with that? Would Vietnam or Australia? No, I think they would be happier seeing Indonesia as a strengthened partner and perhaps pushing on certain issues. But leadership is a case of assigning yourself that position and also having that legitimacy and acceptance amongst others. So again, I'm not sure what institution Indonesia could be in where that would be an easy thing. Even within, for instance, like Bali process, it's a co-chaired sort of process within our eyes. The intelligence grouping that started off as a unilateral within ASEAN. That was a very modest thing. That was something that was about shoring up support, but not necessarily being out there well ahead. So I think it's important to kind of look at what the Indonesian way of leadership might be as well.
Okay, great. As I look through the questions, there's several that align to sort of the elephant in the room that we have managed to not discuss yet. And that deals with the US-China competition and the raising tensions in the South China Sea. And I think the questions out there can kind of be summarized in two questions. The first is, will Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea prompt greater action on the part of Jakarta? And then the second is, how does Jakarta view US-Chinese maritime cooperation, or excuse me, maritime competition? If we want to, Nat, you want to go first so we can kind of switch it up a little?
Yep, no problem. Okay, so it depends what you see as, your question is about, does Chinese assertiveness prompt greater action on behalf of Jakarta? Depends what you consider action. If you're, there was the issue, that in December, and I definitely think Evan can talk more about this, about the presence of Chinese vessels in Indonesia's EEZ. Of course, the stepping up of maritime assets around the Natuna Islands, strident statements by the president, the issue being saturated within the media more than previous Chinese incursions. That's all action to some degree, but I think that has limits. And we all know those limits are because Indonesia has got, as we've talked about, there's so many domestic issues that Indonesia needs to sort out. It needs partners for, and China still continues to become an important part of that story. And particularly now, as Indonesia is going through the challenge of COVID-19, China has been there alongside South Korea, alongside Japan, as providing medical assistance as well, medical vessel protective equipment. But I think, as always, there's that delicate dance to be played between Indonesia protecting its sovereign rights and then, asserting itself. So action may not be the kind of strident action we may expect. There are limits to confrontation. I think a lot of the time Indonesia is doing more on the diplomacy side and those kinds of issues. But I definitely think that's something Evan can add to.
Evan, can you add to that?
Yeah. Thank you, Nat. I think it's absolutely crucial what Nat said about how you define actions. If you define actions in terms of a whole of nation effort to push back China on the South China Sea or Natuna, it may seem like that on some instances, like during the crisis, you may see the deployment of some military assets to the area, some show of flag, if you will. But ultimately, I think they're meaningless because I think at the end of the day, Indonesia's responses to the problems in the Natuna and the South China Sea, I think is very much determined by still, I think, the lack of coherence in the overall response. I think there is no National Security Council to speak of that would be able to integrate all of the different tools that the government has. And we don't have a wide diversity of strategic toolkits to begin with. When it comes to the South China Sea in general, all we can do is rely on ASEAN. When it comes to bilateralism, all we can do is repeat the same steps, which is if there's a problem, we deploy such strong show of will, but then afterwards nothing happens, and then the crisis will recur. I think a part of that problem has to do with the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, when the president is not personally and on a day-to-day basis invested and in managing these issues, it's all left to the different bureaucratic agencies to sort out the mess. And if you cite, for example, oh no, Indonesia has been responding very strongly. Look at the military developments that they've been doing in Natuna for the last few years. Well, the problem is that these were pre-existing plans. These were military development plans that were drafted 10, 15 years ago in the mid-2000s. So the problems in the Natunas and the South China Sea provide political momentum for different agencies to push ahead with their pre-existing plans, whether it's the military, whether it's the Coast Guard. So the events and the crisis became a way to propel pre-existing bureaucratic agencies, whether it's about budget, expanding size, expanding authority, the ability to procure or build new facilities. These are not necessarily the best response to Chinese encroachments, especially when it comes to diplomatic front, because I think the problem with Indonesia's response is that there's a conflation, I think, within Indonesia's foreign policy circle between getting China to, denounce its illegal claims, its 9-dash line, versus a more specific set of outcomes, which is how do we get China to stop fishing in the North Natuna Sea, for example. That, for me, requires a different set of approaches within the diplomatic realm, not a military buildup or new capabilities. And again, it still hasn't solved the problem of the different overlap between the different maritime agencies. So for me, a strong response on China, I would want to see first the ability of Indonesia to figure out who's responding. Is it the Coast Guard? Is it the Navy? Is it some combination of both? How and when? And I think these are the issues that I would like to see more. And I think this is the more important action rather than looking at some superficial response that doesn't stop the problem from recurring.
Just quickly add to that, I mean, this particular issue that happened in December, I remember there was intense media attention on this in January. I remember seeing Evan on, Mata Najwa and other kinds of television programs. And what Evan says, I think, is pertinent, is that you can't just go around flinging military assets expecting nothing to sort of happen. I think what happens there, you inadvertently signal to the Indonesian population that you are going to do something. And so when that happens next time, the Indonesian population will say, well, you're weak if you don't do it again. So what are you going to do every time? Are you just going to keep moving assets there? The president's going to come out and make a couple of strident statements. A couple of ministers are going to say that we can't accept this. A couple of other ministers say, oh, well, China's our friend. It's very confusing, but I think there's also creating that expectation that Indonesia is going to come in hard. And as Evan said, it's just not going to work.
Okay, we have a hand raised by Admiral Bob Gurrier, the president of Pacific Forum. So I'd call on him to ask his question live.
Thanks very much. First, my thanks to the presenters, Evan and Natalie. Fantastic presentations. It's simply a comment for both of your reactions. On the issue of the global maritime fulcrum, and I think maybe thinking of it as a vision, sometimes, visions really fit because they actually are very apropos to the country. And I think this might be a case, it was a vision sized and suited perhaps to Indonesia's true potential. So my question is, in many ways, this vision, I think, could enlarge Indonesia's image and role, often couched and understood in an ASEAN context. Just take it beyond that. It gives it a global vision, and especially the aspect of leadership versus power. So you're stressing, the right things. Because you're one of the biggest stakeholders in archipelagic state, and you go through the history, especially law of the sea, and the role you played in the grand compromise between archipelagic states and the other requests and pushes for throughput and access. So my comment simply is: do you agree that in many ways GMF really could have legs, and that it could give Indonesia a larger role, a role I would argue perhaps more befitting its position, its size, its resources?
Evan, you want to go?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. I think had we followed through on the GMF all the way down to the smallest details in terms of policies, yes, I think the GMF absolutely has the potential to bring Indonesia out of its what my former boss used to call the ASEAN golden cage. ASEAN looks nice, but it really prevents us from doing anything beyond just Southeast Asia. So I think absolutely, I think the GMF had it been followed through until the end and developed and institutionalized and put resources into it, and figuring out how to fix the overlapping institutions and all that. Absolutely, I think if ever, I think in the last 20 years, Indonesia's sort of global identity or rather its leadership profile has always been attached to ideas like, oh, Indonesia is is among the biggest Muslim democracies. It has strong leadership in ASEAN, but the maritime elements have never been fully highlighted up until recently. And I think with maritime, in terms of vision, I think the GMF would have been somewhat less controversial because it doesn't really involve one particular religion or one particular regime type. It involves Indonesia's nature and destiny as a maritime power in the region based on its strategic geography. But no, unfortunately, these structural potentials require agency to fully realize. And as Nat said, it's a crying shame that we never developed it further.
Yeah, actually, I quite like what Evan said in terms of what identities for Indonesia are preferable than others. I never really was a big fan of the, Indonesia is the world's largest democracy because it's too laden with normative expectations that are imposed from the outside rather than from in. While those might be elements that Indonesia has championed at various times, a maritime identity is far more practical and far more natural, I think, for Indonesia. I think part of the issue has been, as foreign observers, when this was announced, everybody latched onto the global part of it, and everyone was like, "Oh, awesome! Indonesia's going to do all these fantastic things," and again, expectations were raised. So yeah, as Evan said, had Indonesia had the ability to sort of try and work out some of those domestic bureaucratic issues, possibly, but when you look at the wealth of challenges that the country itself is facing, and when I'm in Australia, I often point to the fact that the country is still battling, a poverty rate of 10%. In terms of inequality, that's the entire population of Australia. And just to give a perspective of some of the various issues in terms of, even physical connectivity between the islands and the price of moving goods around, and the accessibility for education, nutrition, so on and so on and so forth, you can see where down the priority of, can we get a coherent response together to then play this regional or international role, starts to look a lot more challenging. So, yeah.
Great. We have another hand raised, so I'd like to call on him. That's Commander Jay Tayea from the Philippine Coast Guard, who's also one of my colleagues here at GRIPS. Jay?
Hello, good morning.
Hi, Jay, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Evan and Natalie, for your engaging presentation. In the establishment of a genuine legally instituted Coast Guard organization in Indonesia, when do you think will this be realized? Or is it even part of the GMF, and whether it could be achieved in Jokowi's term? We know that Indonesia is already building Bakamla, but there are other agencies that call themselves the Coast Guard, like KPLP under the Directorate General of Sea Transportation. And there are also agencies that perform Coast Guard function like Maritime Search and Rescue, like Basarnas. Because even here in Japan, as early as mid-2000, they were also expecting that a single Coast Guard organization in Indonesia will be created. And until now, JCG has to deal with various agencies that need their support for capacity building. I would also like to inquire about the possibility of relegating the Indonesian Navy's maritime law enforcement function to a specific Coast Guard organization, whether this would even be realized, or, as you said, the military has been very influential in the maritime strategy of Indonesia.
So if I can be a bit of a jerk, I would like to add one more element to Jay's question, because I see there's several questions in the chat. And that's about Bakamla's new Indonesian Maritime Information Center, the IMIC. There's a lot of curiosity about what kind of potential that has. So I'm hoping you can thread in that info center into your responses. Evan?
Sure. Let me first say that I think initially it was part of Jokowi's GMF in the first 1 or 2 years of his first term on how to boost Bakamla as the single Coast Guard. I think the debate within the maritime community in Indonesia has been sort of polarized into extreme positions. On the one hand, what we have now is what they call a multi-agency single task, that there are so many agencies focusing on maritime governance. So the debate is trying to move that point into another extreme point, which is to create Bakamla as the single agency with multitask. This, I think, is problematic because this idea of creating a single agency with multitask implies that Bakamla is set out to absorb everybody's assets, personnel, and capabilities. Now, in an ideal world, that would be nice. Or if we live in a different political regime, that can just be ordered by the top. But that's unlikely. What we have now is we need to find compromises and conversations between the different maritime agencies. I think the way to go is probably figuring out a way between these two extremes, which is to create two agencies with coordinated tasks. So for me personally, I would like to see just one Coast Guard, which is Bakamla, and one Navy to handle maritime security governance outside of the 12 nautical miles, and the others can be handled by the others. But let's focus on beyond the 12 nautical miles, and that for me has to be just one Coast Guard, which is Bakamla, and then the Navy in some supporting capacity. You can never take out maritime law enforcement from the Navy. So that idea, I think, is a non-starter, but you can figure out a way to coordinate on a day-to-day basis how that can work between the Navy and the Coast Guard. But it cannot work if it's between the Navy and different versions of Coast Guard. So I think we do need to figure out to what extent this can be pushed forward. One idea that was introduced earlier this year surrounding the Natuna crisis with China was, this is what I mentioned earlier, to draft an omnibus maritime security law that would synchronize and ideally harmonize all of these overlapping laws and authorities. But as always, when you create laws, it's a different political bargaining. Instead of bureaucratic, you have to deal with the parliament. You have to deal with all kinds of interests involved. So I think that would be an even more drawn out process. I personally believe, I think Bakamla is in the best position to be our single Coast Guard. But resources, asset, and pushback, I think, from the other maritime agencies have been particularly harsh. So it's like Bakamla is on survival mode right now, and this relates to John's question about the information center. By law, Bakamla is supposed to be the one that holds the maritime information as a fusion, if you will, of the different maritime information from the different agencies. Interestingly, this was launched yesterday, right? I think, or 2 days ago. But this came about after the Indonesian military established its own maritime information fusion center a few months ago, earlier this year. So if you ask me, I think what they have in mind is that different agencies will have their own maritime information collection. And then somewhere down the line, we have to figure out how we're going to channel this into a fusion center. Whether that's outside of these institutions or not, it's not particularly clear. But at the very least, I think for Bakamla, it means they can have their own information without relying on information from others. Whether this worsens or improves the bureaucratic relations, I think remains to be seen. But in any case, I think when it comes to the Coast Guard development, going back to the initial question, for me, the future is with Bakamla and not with the others. But without any forced structural overhauls of the others, I don't think Bakamla can do its job effectively. So as long as Bakamla is only one out of 6 or 7 maritime agencies with patrolling assets, it will just be a patchy maritime governance, and it's about figuring out who takes turn doing what at what day. And I think that's not an effective way to go.
Just quickly, just two things to highlight for me, to build on what Evan said. I think this is really a case where Bakamla is hamstrung by, inter-service or inter-agency rivalry. In the early days when Bakamla was set up, there were meant to be transfer of assets from the Navy that was held up for a while. Bakamla is the product of, the amalgamation, from being a coordinating agency into its own agencies under Chukoi. So I'd be interested to know where that might head under another president, which may not be as personally interested in that as one of his legacies or her legacies. And again, I think it would be helpful if there were obviously more cooperative relations between some of the leaders of these agencies as well. And I would wonder to see what would happen if, the chief of the military might be more inclined to try and find harmony between these agencies for the greater good. But again, these are things that happen in other countries as well. They just happen to be, acute in this context that they were raising them.
Great. We have an interesting question from Professor Furuya from the Japan Coast Guard Academy. He first thanks you both for your great presentations. I echo those thanks. And then he says, when Indonesia becomes a maritime leader, would Indonesia challenge existing international norms and laws? For example, would Indonesia deny the right of archipelagic sea lane passage and claim more waters under sovereignty for Indonesia? I see this as a really interesting question because I think a lot of Americans in particular want to see more Indonesian leadership because they assume that Indonesia will champion the same sort of international law that the United States believes in. And while I fully would like to see Indonesia step up, I do wonder if there might be revisions that might not favor what's the status quo interpretation.
I think this is more of an Evan question. Not
Yeah.
Evan.
Thanks for that. Would Indonesia sort of revise and change international maritime laws and norms? I think when it comes to maritime laws in general, particularly based on UNCLOS, I don't think we would aim to revise it. I think we're trying to push back, in fact, attempts by China to change existing maritime laws to its favor. So I think Indonesia is certainly in the camp of sustaining and deepening how UNCLOS is being perceived today. So I think if we were to become a maritime leader, I don't think we would have become one without that particular platform, which is sustaining UNCLOS, because that also speaks to our legitimacy as an archipelagic state. It makes little sense for us to deny our own legitimacy by trying to have a different interpretation or even a contending a maritime law outside of UNCLOS. Now, whether or not the issue about archipelagic sea lanes or stopping them, or in a recent conspiratorial way in Indonesia, there's been a debate about, oh, maybe we should just close off the archipelagic sea lanes and charge each container $1 per kilogram or something. I don't know. There's all kinds of weird ideas happening right now. So I can see whether or not the outside world thinks that some of the fringe voices in Indonesia could be more dominant. I hope not. But I do think there needs to be a distinction between peacetime and wartime. I think in the 80s and 90s, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe closer to the 80s, this was under Benny Murdani, there was a time when we closed off the archipelagic sea lanes when we were doing military exercises, which sent shockwaves to regional countries. But I think that scenario of wartime closing of archipelagic sea lanes is something that remains quietly discussed, because in wartime, in any scenario of war in the Indo-Pacific, the best and most efficient way, so let's say hypothetically there's a war with China, the best and efficient would be to go through Indonesia from the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So it is in Indonesia's interest to ensure that its waters are not being used in a way that would sustain or even escalate a war situation. But I'm not sure we have seriously talked about this kind of war scenarios in detail. nor do we necessarily have the full requisite capabilities to do so. But in peacetime, I think the archipelagic sea lanes, what we've been doing have been exactly like what UNCLOS has prescribed, and we just announced the third archipelagic sea lanes coordinates and all that. So I think it's still partial. It's not fully operational yet. I think we submitted to IMO a couple months ago, if I'm not wrong. But as far as Indonesia is concerned, we are still committed to UNCLOS and keeping the archipelagic sea lanes open per UNCLOS and making sure that safety and security within our archipelagic sea lanes can be sustained. But wartime scenarios, I think, is a different set of conversations.
We have 4 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is call on you both just to say, do you have any last words, things that you want to get off your chest that you weren't able to answer, things that you think were left out of the conversation? If you could, first Natalie, then Evan, and then we'll do a little wrap up. Natalie?
Sure. Thanks, John. Thanks everybody for your questions and for being here today. The one thing I want to leave again is maybe one of the last points I made, which is just to try and see things from Indonesia's perspective. To pick up a thread that John left. The idea of getting Indonesia to step up. Again, we've got to be pretty realistic about what does stepping up mean, and is that something that is within the Indonesian way and within its capabilities as well.
Thanks, Evan.
To pick up from that, I think Indonesia's multiple challenges have made us very insular. We're so focused on our own problems and our own issues that we tend to ignore what our neighbors think, what the international community thinks. And I think this is a homework for Indonesians, both policymakers and the broader public, to ensure that we don't become insular. We're not just living in our own world, that we, as a maritime nation, we are technically very much open, and we have been open historically from both oceans. So we have to sustain that openness to the outside world and take into account more the views and interests of our friends and neighbors in the region.
Okay, thank you, Evan. And with that, I'd like to invite Bob Gurrier to make some comments on behalf of the Pacific Forum.
Thanks very much. Appreciate again both to John and Jeff for putting this maritime discussion series together, and especially to the guest speakers, Evan and Natalie. I just have to say, the tremendous role that Indonesia can play in the region, just by virtue of its position, its size, its resources, the role it has played in ASEAN, makes this a really timely discussion, and one I hope we can continue to have in the future. I think everyone can agree that Indonesia's place and role, because they're such a major stakeholder in this region, it makes it an absolutely recurring topic. So my thanks for both of you for looking at this. I go back to GMF and the potential of that vision. Sometimes, visions are sticky because they fit, and the notion of a global maritime fulcrum really sets a wonderful frame about the country, its equities, its position, and all the things that it's working towards. So thanks for really getting into these issues. Last point, the notion of leadership versus power, I think, is a really important distinction in this discussion. Often we get hung up on metrics of power, and then that becomes a very zero-sum game. The issue of leadership is something entirely different. And I think a lot of the discussion today talked about leadership and how you can make it a multilateral thing and not a power thing. And I think this often helps us find a way to get to yes in these difficult issues. Thanks again for a great, insightful discussion. Most appreciated.
If I can take the final minute to give a little bit of my own opinion, it seems to me that Indonesian history is about periods when it's been a really great, powerful country, a leader, and in periods where it's been pushed back a bit. And sometimes that we think of Indonesia because it's a series of islands as a maritime state. But if you look through history, sometimes that leadership has been inherently maritime, based on trade. And sometimes it's been actually quite terrestrial, based on the agricultural powerhouse, which is Java. And it seems to me that the new order was a land-based economy and a land-based society in many ways. And now, 20 years after the new order, maybe Indonesia is at a juncture and we need to see which way it goes. As a navalist, as a lover of all things maritime, as a guy who sailed with Indonesian fishermen, I hope to see it go down that one path. But it's interesting to see which way it chooses. And as Natalie has strongly pointed out, it's going to be a decision that is up to Indonesian leaders and the Indonesian people themselves. We'll see how sticky the GMF was. We see that it got a lot of attentions, and it may or may not be sticking. So I hope we can continue this conversation in other forums or back here at a part 2 of the Maritime Discussion Series with YCAPS and Pacific Forum. I hope all of you that joined today, there's been more than 80 of you, I hope you all had a good time. I hope you walk away more informed, and I hope you will join us for future sessions. We're trying to walk through the region in terms of both countries and issues. So if there's something you'd like to hear about, please get in touch with Pacific Forum or YCAPS, and we'll be sure to put it on the agenda. Looking forward to doing another one of these in a few weeks. Thank you very much for your time, and see you soon. Goodbye from Tokyo.